thank you very much for joining us. My name is Helle Jorgensen, and I'm the CEO and founder of Competent Boards. I hope that you all had the opportunity to listen to His Royal Highness Prince of Wales' very wise words earlier today. And I hope that you will think about that action when we are going through this webinar or panel debate today. I also hope that you will put in not only all of these fantastic where you're from in the world, but also questions in the Q&A box. So again, if you heard His Royal Highness this morning, was talking about the Great Reset and the need for action now. And to not only talk, but act, we need leaders, we need board members, we need executives. And we might need new competences in the boardroom and C-suite. So that's the question we're going to discuss now. We at Competent Board set out to find an answer to that question. And I'm very pleased that today we have released our report that outline our findings. And I'm looking forward to discussing the findings with you all during today's panel. But before I do that, before I introduce the panel, let me share just a few words about Competent Boards and the leaders who have submitted their views on the need for new competences in the boardroom and C-suite. So as you see here on the slide, Competent Boards offer the global online ESG Competent Boards certificate program, and we now have a faculty of over 100 renowned international board members, executives, investors, experts, including also the leaders you see on the next page, which is my fantastic panel of today. So may I start by introducing Mervyn King, Professor Mervyn King, may I say, the godfather of good corporate governance as well as reporting initiatives. Mervyn, you have so many titles and accolades, and you continue to have a tremendous impact on sustainable corporate governance. So I want to thank you very much for your leadership and for being with us today. Another leader, Jane Diplock. Jane, you're such an experienced international company director. You're serving on boards in Europe, Australia, Asia, Middle East, and again, long bio. So all of you, I hope that you will look up and see again all the fantastic leadership that Jane both have had and will have and is having. The next fantastic leader, Judith Mosely. Your career is focused on finance in the City of London. You're working in the field of natural resources and are the board member of two gold companies, Eldorado and Galiano. And you also sit on the board of BlackRock World Mining Trust and Women in Mining UK. Last, but absolutely not least, Jessica Fries, the executive chair of the Prince's A4S and our host of this great summit. Thank you, Jessica, for all the work you and your team is doing in bringing the vision of His Royal Highness to life. So a warm welcome to you all, and thank you for contributing also to the Future Boardroom Competences 2020 report and for the willingness to discuss the findings. So you see the report here, and I'm happy to say that it is officially now available on our website for download. The aim of the report is to develop an understanding of how corporate governance has evolved and how board members should be prepared. We developed a 4-question survey and have used qualitative analysis to evaluate the responses. You might say, oh, there's something missing here. So if you believe that there are other competencies needed, please do share. And you find a link to how to share that in the report. So download the report and you'll find there how to share with us what you find is missing. The other thing we want to do is actually figuring out who are top 100 competent boards and who are the top 100 competent board members. So feel free to submit your nominations. Again, there will be in the report a link on how you can submit your nominations. So let's look at the 4 questions that we asked. You see them here. We will now in this hour discuss the findings of each of these questions and leave time for Q&A. So again, send in your questions and answers via either the chat or the Q&A box. Probably the Q&A box is better. So let's start. And the first question, what does stewardship in the 21st century look like? So if we go to the next slide, and the next slide again, we have decided to illustrate the submitted responses via word clouds. So you can see that we illustrate stewardship as an individual in the world who comprises the common words and themes that we received. And the 5 points that you see here summarize the findings. And Mervyn, when we discussed earlier, you said the most important thing is missing, and I've been trying to find that. So can you please elaborate?
Well, first of all, the connotation of stewardship is to take care, and one becomes a surrogate of the owner of an asset, for example. And so care and stewardship in corporate terms has 2 facets. The one is taking care in your business judgment calls. The other is taking care of the assets of a company. During the reign of the primacy of the shareholder, through the 19th and 20th centuries into the 21st century, it was pretty easy because you had a stewardship of the assets reflected in the balance sheet according to financial reporting standards. But when we moved away from focusing on the wealth of shareholders to looking at rather the long-term health of a company and changed to a value creation process rather than profit being subsidized by society and the environment, the range of assets changed. So the makeup of the market capitalization of companies reflected that. So we started with 80% of the makeup of the market cap was so-called non-financial assets or intangible assets, and only 20% was reflected in the balance sheet, and it got less and less. Today, the S&P 500 is in fact 91 and 9%. So stewardship extended, became wider, and now it was stewardship of intangible assets. So one has to start looking at deforestation and the environmental issues and social issues. Health and safety become so important now with the pandemic, for example, and the governance issues, to move away from a mindless checklist approach to a mindful outcomes-based approach, to actually add value in the decision-making process. So it changed, and the stewardship is also to look at that collective mind of the board that makes the business judgment call. Is it a unified one, or is it a fragmented one? A unified one, there'd be singing from the same hymn sheet in regard to purpose. They'd all agree about transparency and being trustworthy and integrity, all the things you have on the screen. But they would also want to agree, what are the value drivers of this business? And what are the needs, interests, and expectations of our different stakeholders? And do we actually understand them? Do we know what the trade-offs are between those stakeholders who make a decision in the best interest of the company? This is taking care in your business judgment call, because the business judgment call you then make, your external stakeholders will draw a conclusion that the company is or is not a responsible citizen. That's clearly part of stewardship today in the 21st century. So the connotation of stewardship has widened in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Widened in the sense of taking care of assets. It's now not only tangible, but intangible assets, and widened in the sense of looking at the business judgment call issues, because you have to look and be mindful about these things and look at the impacts of your product or the service you're rendering on the three critical dimensions for sustainable development: the economy, society, and the environment. So the concept is widened in the 21st century. And the word that I said wasn't there is courage. Because to be a good steward, especially in taking care in that decision-making process, needs courage. It needs curiosity, it needs competency, it needs candor, all the C's. Thank you, Helle.
Couldn't agree more, and I do think it is there somewhere. And I see already coming in here, as it says, very well articulated, Mervyn, and there's other things that what is missing. Jessica, I saw you were sitting there nodding. And anything you want to add on?
Well, I'll come in a little bit to some of the broader questions, but I do think that picking up on Mervyn's point there around courage, I think if we look at the scale of some of the challenges that we face, it is that that courage, that willingness to really be ambitious and maybe take a step and make commitments to things that we don't necessarily have all of the answers for. And that really does take courage. And it is doing it in unison with many other boards, but actually we need that innovation and some of those breakthroughs. So sometimes we do need those courageous leaders amongst the board community who are going to be willing to go out there and pull others along and create the path forward that we really need. And I think we've seen lots of examples of leadership in that arena, but we really need to continue to see that and to see an accelerated pace of change. So I do think that some of the points that Mervyn made there are really important.
Yep, Judith?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one thing that kind of jumps out at me, if we're looking at stewardship as well, is authenticity, and it's a word that is very overused. But I think, you know, if we're going to be responsible citizens and board members, you've got to walk the talk. So, you know, we talk a lot around stewardship, we talk a lot about ESG, and what we must ensure is that there's got to be action beyond talk. And I think that does go to, you know, what, you know, His Royal Highness Prince Charles was saying earlier today, that, you know, this is a call to action. So we do love talking about it, and we do love unpicking it, but, you know, ultimately we must be authentic. And, you know, this goes to the reputation of the organisation. And, you know, what we've seen through the COVID situation is that some companies have not actually been able to walk that talk. They've had lots of words, but actually their actions have not demonstrated their authenticity, and that has a hugely damaging effect. And, you know, when you're looking at the intangible assets of a company, you know, this can become a very significant liability if you don't live to those standards to which you adhere, or you pretend to adhere.
I think you're completely right, and it is going back also to what you're saying, Mervyn, care, and where it is that, you know, especially right now, I think I've been saying, like, you know, cash might still be king, but if you don't have the care, you know, what are you then going to do? So care is so central also to build the loyalty. Thinking about that stewardship, maybe we should then look into what does a future prepared board member look like? So the next question. So if we can go to the next slide, yeah, and perhaps do one more there. So what we decided here was to illustrate that as a brain for the mindset, the outlook for a future prepared board member. And the main themes that you see in the web is kind of like the findings, the gathers from these things that we heard, and then we put into these main themes that kind of like we put in this surrounding web of words. Jessica, maybe I can ask you, if you look at these themes and the brain, anything that surprises you?
I'm not sure there's anything that surprises me. There are definitely some themes that really resonate and connect with some of the work that we've been doing. So grounding it maybe in the experience over the last year, which has obviously presented huge challenges and has made as I think particularly Ban Ki-moon and Shula Kant and of course Prince Wells highlighted earlier, inequalities in society much bigger, and the expectations I think on companies and boards to be responding really put to the test. So one of the things that you've highlighted there is around purpose, and I think that came through in the answers to the first question as well. And what we've certainly seen is that need and test of whether companies are really purpose driven and what that means, and stakeholder oriented. And you've seen some really brilliant examples of how companies have walked the talk and where they have acted in a way that really does think about the opportunities that they have, the ways that they have to contribute to supporting their communities, thinking about their staff, their employees, and using that as the guide to the decisions that they're taking. And recognizing that those dimensions of social capital, human capital are fundamental to both near-term and long-term performance. I think a few others that you've highlighted here. One of the things is around that ambition and that long-term focus. So setting targets, having the right kind of scenarios of what the future might hold, and being able to grapple with a lot of uncertainty across many dimensions. So how can you actually make decisions in that context and continually be revisiting the future and that long term whilst taking decisions in the near term? Two others that I wanted to highlight. One is collaboration. And I think that we see collaboration really coming through very strongly. Again, something that has been demonstrated not by all organizations, but by many in the last year. And particularly important, collaborating with competitors, with others across the full value chain, across different types of organizations. So that might be public and private sector, or between the for-profit and the not-for-profit sector, but really using that as a source of rapid innovation, understanding and response. And then finally, one of the things that you touch on there is that question of transparency and accountability. And I think underpinning that is also then reporting and the kind of information that an organization shares. So earlier today, the IRC was celebrating its 10-year anniversary, and both Jane and Mervyn and many others have been involved in that journey. And I think some of the principles of integrated reporting, where you're really talking about bringing to life how the board is thinking about these issues and reporting them in a way that does give insight into that long term, is really important.
I think this again, I'm just looking at some of the comments we get in, and we, His Royal Highness was talking about, and Ban Ki-moon was talking about the Sustainable Development Goals earlier today, and clearly, one of them is number 17 in terms of also partnerships, as you're pointing to. And I just see one from Edmund here coming in. We speak stewardship and courage. What about those people who feel hopeless, seeing people in queues for food, losing jobs, business closing, and the pandemic levels increasing? We do all the nice talks, but what about the action? Have we failed the vulnerable? I don't know if any of you kind of like will take that. Jane, are you?
I think it's a very good question. And I do think that we need to be thinking about, you mentioned emotionally intelligent, but I think empathy and understanding that the human condition and humanity, people actually matter. That's the most important element, I think, in thinking holistically about your organization and your business model and your purpose. And at the end of the day, we do need to be focused and inclusive of all of the stakeholders from the entity that you're a steward, where you are the stewards. And stewardship does include that embrace of all of your stakeholders. And this false dichotomy between shareholders and stakeholders, I think, its time is over. And we now have to really understand that our stakeholders and our shareholders are equally important, and that the non-financial information or the pre-financial information, which allows us to actually understand how we can better deal and serve to the entire community, is very, very important. There's just one other point that I'd make, and that is that we've long talked about having over-the-horizon radar as stewards of companies, and how wonderful that would be. And the fourth industrial revolution, the technological revolution, is in some respects giving us a look into the future by being able to model possibilities and outcomes. And this allows us to look more directly at the inclusiveness of our business model and purpose, and ask ourselves, going forward, as a future prepared board member, can we utilize these tools and skills to make sure that going forward we are focused on the social and environmental and other elements, as well as the governance. So I'd just leave it there. Thanks, Helle.
And I'm quite sure.
I'll just add something,
Yes.
Helle, that we had an exclusive capitalism for the 19th and 20th centuries, namely focusing on increasing the wealth of the shareholder. Now we've got a more inclusive capitalism, where we look at how the company actually makes its product, how does it make its money? And we look at its product when it goes out into society. What are the impacts on those critical dimensions for sustainable development? And if you get a utopian situation where you have positive impacts on people, planet, and of course you're making profit to service your borrowings and pay your wages, etc., then you're actually closing that inequality gap, because the financial capital model underpinned by the primacy of the shareholder was premised on a basis of increased wealth at the top, and it would trickle down to the impoverished at the bottom. The trickle became treacle. It stuck at the top. It never came down and would never come down. So I think those that are at the bottom, as I call them, the beat of the feet at the bottom of the company and of society, there's a chance with changing from this exclusive capitalism model to an inclusive approach that we actually can start closing that inequality gap. It's much more beneficial to a struggling economy to have that kind of approach than to get aid, because the aid is for the X purpose and then it's used for the Y purpose, or it slips through the fingers of some dishonest politician. So I think we're on the right journey at the moment, but of course there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and I think that and perhaps we should move to question number 3, where we then discuss the competencies that are or should be demanded of board members. And what you'll see on the next slide is that we illustrate with here a hand to symbolize action and learned competencies. Again, you'll see all of the words around there from the findings or the themes, the main themes that we gathered is illustrated in the surrounding web of words. Judith, maybe I can come to you first here, and you will soon have achieved the Global Competent Boards designation. I would like to hear from you, your view on the feedback we received via the survey.
Thank you, Helle. This is a very interesting one. I think, historically, board members have been brought into the board because they've had specific areas of expertise, whether they know a particular industry very well, or they've got financial acumen. And I think whilst all of these skills are still relevant, we need to look at what new competencies are required to address the risks, the challenges, the opportunities that we now face in this new normal as we work our way through the pandemic And also, you know, as we recognize the real importance and the balance between business, society and planet. So I think experience and expertise from a clearly defined industry background are no longer adequate for the board member of the future. And I think we need to embrace broader skills, which you've highlighted here, and be prepared to acquire new ones as well. And I think historically, board members have kind of brought their old baggage to the boardroom, as opposed to learning new skills in the boardroom and for the boardroom. And I think one of the things that really jumps out at me here, and it's no surprise, is the SDG competent aspect here. And I think, you know, boards have always had a focus on environmental, social and governance issues. It's not new, but it's been very fragmented. And I think what the SDGs give us is a framework within which to operate. And they really do set the foundation for us understanding the ESG risks and opportunities that businesses face. So it's absolutely no longer a side issue. It's something that's fundamental to a business. And you know, these are things that drive the success of a business and should drive the success of a business. I think, and we've touched on this a little bit already, you know, board members need to understand much more than just the financials. Financial results are really the outcome of behaviours, values, the purpose, drivers of the business. And I think if we're going to be forward-looking and challenge ourselves as board members, we need to think about, you know, possible future scenarios. And so competency around both financial and non-financial performance indicators is absolutely critical. And competence around not just looking at risk, which I think board members are very good at, and emerging risks over the longer term, but also thinking equally about the opportunities in the short, medium and longer term. And I think boards are less good at that and much better at looking at risk and looking at historical risk. So we've got to shift the way in which we approach risk going forward. We've touched on technology, and I think, you know, whilst we don't all want to be or cannot all be technology experts, I think, you know, we can't expect technology to sit in an IT department and be owned in a silo. It's something that we've all got to have an understanding of, both in terms of the risks that technology poses, but also the potential opportunities that it can also present to us in terms of transforming our business. And I think we need to be much more focused, you know, on our whole stakeholder value chain, you know, and that goes to our fiduciary duty as directors as well. You know, to create a sustainable business, we've really got to take a much broader approach in terms of the whole ecosystem of our stakeholders. So, you know, the research and feedback that you got very much resonated with that. And I mean, I think in terms of, you know, when we're looking at how we identify gaps on the board, you know, we look at the board matrix and what skills and competences we need. I think that's going to change, and that is changing. You know, whether we hire for specific ESG competence, I'm not sure. I think all board members need to have ESG competence and recognise the importance of continuing learning. I think it's not something that can sit with a committee or a part of the organisation. It's got to be within the organisation, and all board members need to commit to understanding ESG if they're going to be successful in terms of, you know, really respecting the planet and creating a sustainable and profitable business. So I think fundamentally, and I think, you know, we highlight it here as well, it's going to be some of the softer skills and our willingness to learn, to adapt, to collaborate with each other as board members, both with inside the board and with others, you know, peer companies, that will make a successful board member of the future. And I think, you know, we really do need to challenge ourselves, the ability to challenge and to challenge the execs, to challenge all of the assumptions. You know, when you come in as a new board member, it gives you a huge opportunity to challenge the status quo. And I think we need to keep that energy with us as we stay on boards to ensure that we ask those difficult questions and feel brave about doing it.
And I think that's a good point, Judith, but also goes back to courage, right? Because I think it's there's a survey just was also published not that long ago, talking about that perhaps not all board members really feel that courage to speak up in the boardroom. Jessica, you're nodding. So, do you want to chime in on this?
It's not so much on that point, although I would agree with that, and I don't think it's just, you know, board member. I think it's all of us and everyone at every level in an organisation, that it is hard to make yourself vulnerable, and maybe that's not something that we've touched on so far, but I do think that it comes back to some of those points on emotional intelligence and, you know, but being willing to be exposed, but particularly when you're a board member, you're a long way into your career, you're there in what is seen as this position of leadership, to maybe admit that you're not all over all of the issues that we're talking about, and there's a real breadth of them. So I do think that honesty and that willingness to be vulnerable is quite important. One other thing that I did see coming up in some of the chat was also something that I do think is really key. And Judith, when you were talking about the SDGs and that being a really good framework, one of the things that I touched on earlier and I do see as really fundamental is that shift from a language of ESG, which I still think, and this is a point that somebody made in the chat or the Q&A, still has a sense of it being separate from the financials, separate from the strategy and the business. With the SDGs, that really does have at the heart of it both the economic, the financial, as well as the social and environmental, and recognizes how interconnected those different areas are. And I think it is that shift that we really need to see happening, and no longer, and I don't think there's any ways to simplify some of the language, because we need these shorthands, but when we use terms like that, I think it's always really important to come back to the fact that you're talking about that holistic, interconnected approach rather than something separate that gets thought about.
Yeah, and one of the things you also need is the competences to actually look at both the Q&A and the questions and everything. So now I get like in the chat that there is also questions. We will get to the questions, so please just keep on with the questions as well. And perhaps some of the things that you touched upon now, Jessica, is what we have in the last question. So maybe we move to the last question, which is that what are the personal traits, qualities, and diverse perspectives that's needed in the boardroom? And you'll see that here we illustrate with a heart for the internal compass, the personal traits, the attributes. And again, the main themes are gathered from the findings, is illustrated in this surrounding web of words. Jane, I would love to hear your perspectives on this.
Thank you very much, Helle. Can I just firstly say that looking at pre-COVID, I think I would have said fundamentally that the traits, personal traits, qualities and perspectives are pretty much the same, perhaps this decade as last decade, with a little emphasis on technology and some understanding of climate change. But I think the experience of COVID has dramatically changed the world. And I think it's fundamentally changed some of the competencies and qualities and perspectives that are needed in the boardroom. And the first one I'd like to say is that really the UN SDGs have been front of mind for many people, but they've been somewhat seen as a perspective of governments, reporting on how various governments' activities were going and in relation to measurement of implementation of the SDGs. But I think what COVID has done is make it very clear that business has a huge role to play in the implementation of the SDGs, and that actually the implementation of the SDGs is our pathway to recovery, to building better, to a more equal, to a more responsive global recovery. And that if we look at that as the pathway, with all of the challenges that some of our members of our audience are suggesting to us about evaluating applications and criteria and all of that, nevertheless, do think that businesses need to be looking very, very positively at their purpose and how their purpose is addressing this path to recovery, which is the implementation of the UN SDGs in my perspective. So that's one point. The second point I'd make is that the fourth industrial revolution has been massively accelerated by the use of the internet through the COVID period and beyond. And our use of the internet as we move to a cloud-based universe has absolutely skyrocketed. And what we're swimming in artificial intelligence, whether we know it or not. And the manifestations of the use of data is both an opportunity and a risk for businesses all around the world, and it's vitally important. So if we match those two forces together, if you like, the emphasis on the implementation of the SDGs and the data revolution, I think then the personal traits, qualities and perspectives needed in the boardroom are actually somewhat different. It's a different emphasis, at least in stewardship. For example, I think empathy, something which perhaps was not seen as one of the highest qualities, it's here in the heart in your diagram. It's critical for actually understanding how the purpose of your corporation or entity will affect all of your stakeholders, including your shareholders and your communities. And it's vital for trust that being built in entities, that empathy be shown. People matter, as I said earlier on. Tolerance for ambiguity. The huge changes that have been brought about by the pandemic, by climate change, the challenges to business models all over the world. I think we need to understand that sometimes, and the changes in technology, require decision trees that may require two or more seemingly conflicting approaches to be adopted at the same time, to be tested, to see what works, to try innovation, to perhaps not always be able to be sure of what the answer is going to be and have to be able to handle ambiguity. And technological competence. Now, I do agree that we can't all be technical experts, but every aspect of business models are being challenged by the data revolution. And the governance of these new techniques and methods of doing business, artificial intelligence, data analytics, blockchain, other things, they need to be governed appropriately. We need to understand as stewards what is actually happening in our business models, how they're being used, how personal privacy issues are being dealt with. All of these elements that are critical to the useful management of the data, which is so fundamental now to so many, well, almost all businesses. And we need, obviously the other side of that is cybersecurity is vitally important. And how is that managed in this brave new world? We need agility. Boards have to be open to be swift about, to have a swift about turns when changes in direction happen suddenly, as we found in the pandemic. Business models that have been tried and true for a long time were suddenly cut off at the knees because those who were actually managing those businesses were not agile enough, and the results were often disastrous. But at the same time, we need to be skeptical. We need to be skeptical about what the data is telling us. We need to be skeptical of how we use it. We need to be skeptical of being told that it's all right, don't you worry your head about that. We've got it under control. We do need to understand more about how data is governed and how the big opportunities that artificial intelligence and other technological developments will give to us. We need to be much more inclusive, and I think other speakers have spoken about this. We need to be looking at all possible stakeholders in our business model, particularly those whom the digital divide will make unable to access various elements of our business model. And how do we deal with that? questions of open banking and other techniques to try and reach the broader stakeholder communities are very, very important at this moment, and to give people opportunities so that there's not a worse haves and have-nots. We need to be looking at our supply chains. Interestingly, the Swiss referendum on supply chains that just was recently defeated, I think, is a canary in the coal mine for boards of directors around the world. This problem will not be defeated by one referendum. Eventually, directors will have to take responsibility for what is happening in their supply chains and perhaps legally or otherwise deal with it. So I think the trays and different perspectives that they're related to the competencies we discussed earlier, but in some ways they're a different set of perspectives that boards are going to need in the post-pandemic 21st century. Thanks.
Now, Jane, as the perils of technology, we've touched on that. I think Helle has disappeared.
Oh, no.
Mervyn, I don't know if I'll pick up until she pops back up. But Mervyn, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to the remarks that Jane was just making there.
Yes, one thing that hasn't been spoken about is spiritual intelligence. Spoken about emotional intelligence. By that, I don't mean religion. I mean the acceptance by directors that the company is an incapacitated artificial person that has no conscience, and that the directors are in fact the conscience of the company. So you've got to be conscious corporate leaders. And unless certainly, that's why I formed the Good Governance Academy about 2 years ago, to bring the best of thinking about the intellectual intelligence, the emotional intelligence, and spiritual intelligence, and teaching young people who are becoming accountants or lawyers or MBAs, whatever, about being conscious corporate leaders. Because when you're a conscious corporate leader, it becomes apparent to one that the ESG factors and the financial factors must be integrated. I mean, it's a very simple formula. Without a planet, we wouldn't have had people. Without people, we wouldn't have had prosperity. And they are integrated. They can never be separated. And we carried on business, in my mind, in an unusual manner, in a financial bubble. And now we're moving to carry on business in the triple context of people, planet, and profit. And that has always been the situation. The tragedy is we ignored people and planet. And in fact, profit, as we all now know, was subsidized by people and planet. And consequently, we had a century of unsustainable development. So we now have this tragedy of using natural assets faster than nature's regenerating them. And we have to correct it. Otherwise, we certainly won't have a sustainable planet. So there's some questions which are in the mists, and we don't know the answer to them. Can you have economic growth and sustainability, or are they incompatible? I mean, is it really a situation where restorative growth is the only true sustainable growth on the planet? In other words, a circular economic business model. These are questions to which we have to find answers. And only as conscious corporate leaders can we do so, and integrating all these factors. That's why I'm such a big supporter of integrated thinking. And it's central to modern governance, to mindful outcomes-based governance, is integrated thinking. And all these things have to be integrated. We can't think of them separately anymore. So I just think spiritual intelligence is something that's been overlooked. And to my mind, it's critical that young people are taught that a company, in fact, when something goes wrong, the wrath of society turns against the company. The company is innocent. It's always been innocent. And the wrath should be against its corporate leaders who have either made the wrong business judgment call or gone rogue. So conscious corporate leadership, spiritual intelligence is a critical issue as much as emotional intelligence. And I'll just make that point as a trait. And then I just want to add one further thing. And that is, we keep talking about diversity on boards, but very few people talk about intergenerational diversity. Our boards have got people that are too old. We need millennials. And we need, some boards I've advised to have an advisory board made up of Generation Z people with non-disclosure and good faith clauses. And millennials will think differently on that board. And then you'll put a question to Generation Z people and they'll have another thought. And you put it back into the mix and hopefully come out with a better business judgment call in this very changed world in which we're going to have a new normal. So I think spiritual intelligence is something we've got to be very aware of.
And it looks like, Mervyn, that people are totally agreeing with you. I should say that you also need to have a good connection. So I disappeared for a moment, which means that some of the questions have disappeared from my screen. So I need to have others to help me in terms of when we now move to the Q&A. So the first question I have now on my screen is from Alan Willis, but I know that there were 4 other questions. So Jessica, are you able to see the questions that came in?
Yeah, do you want me to read out the first question for you?
I mean, you're kind of like, this is the association, so please.
So I think we've touched on it to a degree, and this is one of the questions that that came up much earlier in the conversation, but around what we can do to prevent people from not just talking the talk, but actually walking the walk, and what everyone feels is holding leaders back from doing that and from really living and breathing some of the things that we've touched on. So I think we've all talked about what we feel is important, but we all know that there are examples where and Mervyn, you were just touching on some of it, where people don't act in the way that we're describing and we feel is necessary. So that's the first question.
Judith, do you wanna take that one? Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in today's environment, I think, you know, part of the reason.
Judith, you're frozen.
I think it's that time of day, isn't it? Certainly in the UK.
Why people are at the moment, but what we mustn't do is take our eye off the ball in terms of the longer term. But I think that is one of the challenges that we've faced. How do we make people look at key performance indicators? And that's got to be in terms of the organisation itself, its non-financial performance measures, and also ultimately in the way the execs are managed and remunerated. And I think that we're at a very, very early stage of that. And there's a lot of controversy around whether that, you know, how that's going to migrate. But I think ultimately, if it's, you know, if it's measured, it will be done. I do think there is something to be said around that, but you have to make sure that obviously you've got the right structure in place to measure performance for all ESG elements. But that would be my kind of comment. I think, you know, we're at an early stage of this journey, you know, so we're still really finding our way in this, and there's a long, long way to go.
Perfect. And yes, it might be this time of day. I hope we all stay on now. And thank you, Jessica, just posted in the questions. So the next question I can see here is, do you consider education and training as critical success factors for future ready board members, especially of SMEs? Jane, I know that, oh, Mervyn, do you want to take that?
The answer is absolutely in the affirmative. At my university, we are launching in the beginning of next year, the Chief Value Officer accreditation. And simply because it is, and IFAC has agreed with me, that to call an accountant today a chief financial officer when he or she is not sitting in a corner office preparing an AFS according to IFRS for consideration by an audit committee. He or she is looking across that whole value creation, preservation, erosion, and you've got to account for these things. And they are, through their education, they're aware of these public interest issues. And I've seen in C-suites, the accountant is the true change maker. He or she's got a better understanding of this value creation process which we've moved to rather than profit at any cost. So education becomes absolutely critical. And I'm absolutely firm about this. And that's why I launched the Good Governance Academy. And I see Fiona Robertson is on the line. She's one of my adherents. And I've worked with her at Leeds University. And the teaching has to change. It's got to be multidisciplinary for young accountants. So I've done work in Australia at Monash, Jane, where Professor Nick McGeegan, one of the subjects they teach their accountants is philosophy, because he says the double entry bookkeeping system and what accountants learn will be done by artificial intelligence. But accountants need to think laterally and be advisors and to be the true change makers. So he agreed with my subtitle of my book, Chief Value Officer, Accountants Can Save the Planet. And His Royal Highness effectively was saying that today in his speech, that accountants, but they need multidisciplinary training, not just training about financial management and double entry bookkeeping systems. If they have this multidisciplinary training, that there's true integration of the ESG factors and the financial factors, and then we've got to look at them as being connected, and I call it integrated, then I think we're going to have better board members. And I have got an horizon of 2030. I've said to my university, a university in the UK, a university in France is launching also next year a Chief Value Officer accreditation, that if you change that thinking, we imagine the thousands of young people will come out thinking in a multidisciplinary manner, rather than that tunnel focus vision, which I invite you all to Google Monash University and look at dating an accountant. What Nick McGeegan did, he took someone from the arts department, someone from the arts department, two ladies, dated 6 accountants, filmed them secretly, then of course disclosed it. And you'll see they talk about something and the accountant keeps on coming back to a sort of tunnel view about something. They keep pulling it, he keeps coming back to it. And he edited this, and have a look at this, dating an accountant. And it shows why he's right. And the whole syllabus has changed. So we need to teach our young accountants to think exactly as His Royal Highness was saying today. They've got to be the true change makers in that C-suite, and they can be, and they have to be. So I think education is absolutely critical. And by 2030, if we can have conscious corporate leaders who learn about intellectual intelligence, learning about what they have to learn about, emotional intelligence, dealing with things so you actually resolve things respectfully, not banging people on the head, etc., etc. And you have spiritual intelligence. If you can teach that, you have conscious corporate leaders.
Love it, Mervyn. And Jane, I'm also looking at the clock here, and you're ahead of us. It's actually your morning, your Tuesday morning now. And I know you serve on the Singapore Exchange, where you also have the stewardship guide, I guess you call it. So the question that I see in terms of the biggest challenge facing the application of sustainable development goals is the lack of clear criteria for evaluating the applications of the sustainable development goals. Do you see, I mean, it continues, my question is it the responsibility of the board of directors to set such indicators at the level of the institution? Is this something also when you think about the stock exchanges? Should stock exchanges start asking these questions?
I do think stock exchanges should start asking these questions. I think that the issues of clarification, there are an enormous number of indicators, as everybody knows, for the Sustainable Development Goals. And it is really a matching exercise between the purpose of the corporation and those relevant Sustainable Development Goals, which are often interlinked with others. But so there is a bit of a challenge there, but I think it's a challenge worth taking. And stock exchanges could give guidance on this. I was fortunate enough to help judge the New Zealand integrated reports that have been produced just recently. And a number of the entities here, both public sector, private companies, iwi, the Maori trusts, had all related their purpose of their business to the United Nations relevant United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I thought that was a very, very refreshing way of reporting. Now, they weren't necessarily all using the same indicators, but they were looking at their own purpose and what the most important indicators for, as they saw, for success in that implementation journey, and identifying them at this stage. So yes, I think there's a lot of work to be done. But as I said earlier, I think this is the pathway to global recovery, and we need to embrace it, and all parts of the ecosystem of value creation need to embrace it. And that includes, of course, the stock exchanges.
Fantastic.
Can I just make one other small point on SMEs that was raised? And that is that the supply chains to all other businesses, the heart of that and the heart of many economies around the world are SMEs. And they too must be encouraged and assisted to look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and how they can participate in implementing them, and also participate in the technical revolution to enable them to be able to talk through data to other entities. So just let me leave you with those 2 points.
And that's a very good point. And perhaps if we go to the next slide, we have some action points for you all. But I would love to have one action point also from all of you, because I see we're just about to be more questions to go through, etc. But if Mervyn, you should have one word or two of action, what would that be for people to say, you know, what is they should do now? Is that find the courage, or what would be your one word?
Well, I think it's all the C's. It's courage, curiosity, competence, capacity, and candor. You've got to have all those qualities as a director. It's as simple as that. And there's got to be a realization that you're acting for an incapacitated person, the company. I mean, I find it quite extraordinary. I mean, if you go back to the Enron days, Mr. Skilling is saying that he was a church-going man and everything in mitigation of sentence. And I would have loved to have been the prosecutor and asked him, but Mr. Skilling, if you'd been the guardian or the trustee of an 8-year-old incapacitated child, would you have done to this child what you did to this company? It's extraordinary. But people don't do it to individuals, but they do it to companies. And the limited liability company has become the most important citizen in the world today. It's the medium through which capital is raised, jobs are created. And yet directors act out of self-aggrandizement, sometimes self-interest, and fear is one of the worst things of a director. Fear, to have no courage to take make business judgment calls which are difficult. So yes, I think those C's are very important that I've pointed out.
And I can see people want all the C's again, Mervyn, but maybe we can put them in the chat. Jessica, your one word, even though if Mervyn have not taken them all.
I think, conscious of time, I can't better Mervyn's 5 C's. So I think it is a huge number of issues that we've covered here. But if I had to pick one, I think the one that has really resonated with me from the conversation is probably that one on courage. I think we have needed it over the past year. We're going to continue to need it. And that's something that I think can help to guide us into the future.
Courageous boards. Judith?
Gosh, it's all been covered. I would say speak out. You know, don't be afraid to speak out. Believe in yourself. You bring something different to the board than everybody else. So be bold and speak out when you need to.
Jane?
I think transparency. I think trust is linked to transparency. And I think good boards are open and honest with their stakeholders and their shareholders about where they are on their journey and how they're going to get to a position where people can be confident and trust them completely. And transparency is a vital, but it's not unlinked, it's linked to courage as well. It's often quite hard to be totally transparent, particularly about the things that perhaps don't go as well as you hope. So those 2 things together, I think.
It's all interconnected. Thank you all so much. I see selflessness. I see a lot of great words here. Those of you there are some words that's missing. Please do go in, download the report. You can download it on the page. If you go one slide back, you can actually see where you can download the report. If there are words that's missing in the report, you can actually, there's a little dot, press it, and you can let us know what you believe is missing or other thoughts that you think that's really important. And then, as I said at the start, we will start taking nominations for who are top 100 competent boards and who are top 100 competent board members, so we can start a positive race to the top. And last, I of course hope that you will join peers and our faculty to further discuss and develop your competences with the ESG Competent Board Certificate Program. And of course, you can find more on the website as well. So with that, thank you for joining us today. I hope that you will enjoy the rest of the 2 weeks of A4S Summit, and that, most importantly, that you will actually put the learning into action. So with that, thank you, panel. Thank you all.
Thank
I
you,
know we
Helle,
have many
Jane,
questions.
Judith.